We're recording this interview on Wednesday, May 3rd, and we're 2 days into the Alberta provincial election. And it is not only going to be a squeaker, but it's going to be fascinating to see how the vote breaks between the United Conservative Party, who currently form government, and the New Democrats, who formed government from 2015 to 2019. It is right down to the wire at the moment. So I'm going to talk to David Coletto, who's the CEO of Abacus Data, and they've been out in the field recently and have some very interesting polling data to discuss. So welcome to the interview, David.
Good to see you, Markham.
Likewise. Now, is it fair to say, I mean, your data basically shows that the UCP and the NDP are statistically tied in terms of voter intent. Walk us through the numbers.
Yeah, so, ours, like a number of other polls, are showing an incredibly tight race, probably perhaps the closest election in Alberta, as that election starts, that we've really ever seen. And we've got among likely decided voters, the NDP at 47, the UCP at 46, the Alberta Party at 4, and other parties at 2. Any way you slice it, basically, the parties are tied province-wide. Now, obviously, anyone who's observing Alberta politics will say, well, the province-wide number isn't really going to tell us too much because it's all going to come down to likely Calgary and how do voters in Calgary vote. And what we're seeing there is a slight advantage for the UCP. They're ahead by about 6 points. Given the margin of error, it's still very close, but we're showing a slight advantage for the UCP. The NDP is well ahead in Edmonton, and then the UCP is well ahead outside of those two big cities. So the story will be about what's happening in Calgary, but as you said, this is an incredibly close election, and campaigns can matter, and so it's starting neck and neck, and it could very well end that way.
What are we to make of Calgary? Because I lived there for 10 years and know the city well, know the politics reasonably well. And Calgary voters have always been, even though they're very socially liberal, it's a very cosmopolitan place, they also know that their personal fortunes, whether they're in the oil industry or not, rise and fall with the price of oil and the price of gas. So they're very much, they might be socially liberal, but they're very interested in economic policy and pocketbook issues. Is that a fair take on Calgary voters?
I think it is. And I think those two perspectives often could be in conflict depending on the choice that's available to them. And I think that's what's happening in this election. So on the one hand, you have the UCP, which I think most Calgarians would feel safer when it comes to who's going to protect the oil and gas sector, who's going to defend it, who's going to encourage it to grow. But at the same time, Danielle Smith in particular, as leader of the UCP, challenges their social liberalism, right? This is a leader who said some things in the past and recently that makes a lot of Calgarians who would normally vote for a conservative party, whether it be the Conservatives federally or the United Conservatives provincially, uncomfortable. And so you've got a choice in front of just, I think, Albertans generally, but in particular Calgarians, between a safe choice when it comes to their key economic driver, but then perhaps a safer choice in the New Democrats when it comes to issues like social policy, healthcare policy, the education, and then that cultural question about like who's best aligned with my values, and that's where I think that's why this election is so interesting, and it's creating right across the province a sorting of sorts in a way that I think Alberta politics hasn't seen before, in that those culturally conservative, fiscally conservative voters are sorting into the UCP, and then everyone else is left with the New Democrats.
I'd be interested to get your view on something that is uniquely Albertan, and that is the influence of Bozo eruptions on elections. And this goes back to 2012. When Danielle Smith, who currently leads the UCP, of course, was leading the Wild Rose Party. She was widely expected. Polls were showing right up to the last week that her party was going to win. And then there was the Lake of Fire incident. Alberta voters will remember that very well. And so there's been a lot of speculation because of Premier Smith's loose-lipped approach to various issues, even now, that Bozo eruptions will play a big role here. And of course, yesterday we saw the conviction of Pastor Artur Pawlowski on 3 charges, criminal charges. And of course, she's been very closely tied to Pawlowski, including in a video that she threatens to sue CBC over running. Anyway, seems like we're early in the campaign. Bozo eruptions are beginning already. What role do you think they might play here?
Well, I think they could play a big role. As you said, I remember that 2012 Alberta campaign quite well. And Danielle Smith should have been premier over 10 years ago, but things that happened in that campaign made her unacceptable to way too many Albertans, and they went back to their safe place of the PC party and Alison Redford at the time. I think today it's not just perhaps what her candidates might be saying. I mean, a lot of them are incumbents, so they're a little more disciplined and perhaps have less baggage or things that they said in the past because they've already been elected. But it's really focused on her. And I think that's the biggest liability in a strange way for the UCP is its leader right now. Because when we ask Albertans, when we ask them to think about both Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley and ask them, do you feel that, either of them is too extreme, has good judgment, is competent, on a range of these kinds of personality characteristics, Rachel Notley actually performs better than Danielle Smith, in particular on that is too extreme, is hiding her views to make herself more acceptable, and has good judgment. These are all things that are real liabilities for Danielle Smith. So anything that happens during the campaign that reinforces that perception that people have of Smith is going to hurt her, which is why I think you've heard she's not going to take questions from media every day. They're going to try to limit access to her because as I said, I think she's probably its greatest liability right now.
Now, you've asked some questions about current and past voting habits of your respondents. And one of the fascinating things about your data shows that those who voted UCP in the last election, only 60% are indicating that they'll do so this time around, committed voters, whereas with the NDP, it's 87%. And that leads us into a very large block, about 19% of voters who are reluctant UCP. And that seems to be the key, is can Danielle Smith lure them back into the to the UCP tent? Have I got that right?
That's right, and it's a group we've been tracking really since the end of last year, and it's perhaps in my mind the group that's going to perhaps decide the election, right? Because these are naturally conservative voters. These are folks who vote federally for the Conservatives, voted for Jason Kenney in the UCP in 2019, but today say, I'm either undecided or I'm actually, a third of them are saying I'm voting NDP right now. And I call them reluctant because, again, they're naturally conservative. This is where their natural home is, but there's something, and I think it's primarily Danielle Smith and perhaps some of the things that Jason Kenney did when he was in office that has turned them off. And they're more likely to be women. There's a large concentration, although they're not all in Calgary, many of them are. And so these voters are going to be really important to the outcome, whether they stay home, because again, they don't all see the NDP as a safe, acceptable alternative either. So some of them might just decide, look, both of these choices are faulty or not perfect, and I don't want to choose either. But I think this campaign is going to be about speaking to them and getting them to ultimately get into the race. Because one of the interesting things of our poll is most Albertans believe this election is going to be close. And when voters know it's going to be close or think it's going to be close, they are more likely to vote. I expect turnout to be perhaps higher than it was in 2019.
Let's talk about age and gender. This is very interesting, the breakdown between, I suppose we shouldn't be surprised that men would be more likely to vote Conservative and women more likely to vote NDP. What about age breakdowns? Anything interesting there?
Yeah, we do see some effect of age. Younger Albertans, those under the age of 45, are more likely to vote NDP almost by 10 points. So it's a significant difference. And the opposite is true of those over 45. So age is related to how people are going to vote, as is, interestingly, education. It's increasingly, in all the polling I do, one of the key vote drivers. Those with a university education are 14 points more likely to say they're going to vote NDP than UCP. And among those with with a college degree or only high school, for example, the UCP does better there. So there's these strains of generational differences, as you said, gender differences, and also educational differences, which is, I think, a cue or a proxy for, do you work in blue collar or white collar kind of jobs, how old you are, and all those kinds of things interact with that.
What about small parties? Now, this is interesting because, generally the Alberta Liberal Party polls 2, 3, 4% on election day. If I remember correctly, in 2019, the Alberta Party, which is generally considered to be kind of a centrist party, I think they got 8%, if I remember correctly. But this time around, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems much more polarized.
Yeah, it is. I think partly because the Alberta Party's leader isn't as high, as well known as the previous one. Stephen Mandel was the previous Alberta Party leader. He'd been the former mayor of Edmonton, had been a cabinet minister in the PC government, and so had a name recognition and had run candidates in every constituency. That's not happening this time. So the Alberta Party has some candidates, but not running everywhere. And I think because of the nature of the debate and how, in a way, polarizing both of the main choices are, it's creating that effect where, you're seeing Alberta, which has historically been a one-party province, moved into a multi-party province over the last number of elections, is perhaps moving towards a really a two-party option where you've got a more urban, progressive, social democratic inclined party in the New Democrats up against a more populist, right-wing option in the UCP. And that doesn't leave much room when those two choices are so starkly different for people to pick a middle choice. And that's why I think you're seeing that kind of polarization happen.
Well, David, thank you very much for these insights, and we will be coming back to you regularly during the campaign to see how things are going. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Markham.